were starving to death. And I've only found 4 references, and Gideon's the one I remember off the top of my head, 4 references that talk about that starvation that happened on Kodiak. By golly gee, you're not going to hear about that in the historical accounts because nobody wants to say, oh, we starved these people because we didn't give them enough food. They're not going to talk about it. It's a really ugly part of the history and facts of what happened to my ancestors on Kodiak and what happened to the ancestors of the Onongan people. And those are things that I've been slowly pieced together here and there. I find one reference and then I go, oh, wow, that's interesting. How do we get these facts out? How do we talk about it in a way that allows us as Native peoples to, I want to be angry because I was angry during graduate school. I read this stuff. I get angry. It ate me up to the point where it's like, wait, this is pointless. Why am I angry? I can't change the past. I can't go and make a difference there. So I started to think about this as a way of, okay, how do we educate our communities so that we are not repeating ourselves? Why is it that we have all these other issues that we carry forward in ourselves? The alcoholism, the abuse, and all these other things that we have to deal with today. How do we change that? Know your history. That way you can ask those specific questions about why are we doing this? But then we can start to change our behavior. Having the privilege to work on Kodiak for 13 years as a museum director, but having the museum run me, and then using the museum as a tool to not just share the history, but show how we can be back in control of our own lives through using museum collections, through using our history to change and know who we are so that we can make our own decisions. We can actually have this knowledge and have this ability to change ourselves. The bigger challenge that we have is we do not like to be preached to. We've been preached at for so much that when somebody comes and says, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that. Yeah, go away. Not going to do it. How do we change that? How do we do it in a way that's not preaching? I've learned over the years living in the village, working in the museum, having been told what to do all the time. Oh, you got to do this. Oh, you got to do that. And realizing it's like, okay, wait a minute here. We don't have to do anything we don't want to do. But if I can give you the facts, we can share the facts with you. We can share that knowledge. We can use that to start changing what we do. And for me, when I had the privilege to work in the villages, we went and used museum collections to take and relearn about how to not just make models, but take this to make a full-size Onyak. Use this knowledge so that we can show that our ancestors had that bulbous bow design that now is on all these big boats. We had this for over 1,000 years. And I ask every one of the kids in my villages, so your ancestors designed this because of the heavy seas that we deal with through years of learned experience. They needed a supercomputer, they used a dolphin, and they had billions of dollars to develop this technology. And we already had it. This is brilliant. How brilliant were they? They designed something that, to me, superseded the supercomputers. And yet we're told we're primitive savages. This is just one example of, I think, many things that we can go back and start looking at for what our ancestors had and did. The bunny boot that is used in the Arctic by the military, they took that from the Inuit. They used that knowledge of how to design that boot from the Inuit. Little things like that where you start to piece together the history, but piece together this innovative brilliance. It's pretty amazing. Just one example after another. Using the gut skin jackets. This is a bear intestine from Kodiak. They used bear intestine as a waterproof garment. That worked as a raincoat, but worked as more like a Gore-Tex. It's pretty amazing. Just simple, pretty complicated things. A waterproof stitch. You start asking this, and you start asking the kids to think about this. When we've been told that we're nothing but dumb savages, and then you show them this, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, we're not. You undermine what's been written and what we've been told with facts. For me, then you can start to change not only what's up here, but what's in here. And if you're able to do that, you set another path for the next generation. And that's the bigger challenge that we have, is how do we get the facts out? How do we share this knowledge in ways that not just reach the next generation, but changes that generation's own thought of itself, so that we're not repeating it, and we're not repeating all the social ills that we continue to carry forward because we've been so beaten down. We actually even now teach our own children that without thinking about it. I feel very lucky, like with my wife, she would ask me, why are you doing that? And I couldn't answer. And when I couldn't answer, I would stop and really think about why I was doing what I was doing, and start to realize, wait a minute, I need to change this. I don't want my children growing up this way. I don't want them learning this learned behavior that I learned, so that when they have their kids, they're not passing this same intergenerational drama, anger, fear, hate of oneself that we carry with ourselves so strongly. That change has to come from within each of us. And that's I think one of the bigger challenges that we have for all ourselves. How do we get to that point? How do we move forward so that we're not repeating it? Well, with Russian colonialism, it wasn't as, while there was that initial subjugation during the Shelikoff and Baranov stage. After 1818, there was more of a thriving, I would say, of our people in that area, because they became Creoles, mixed blood, but people who were able to work their way up. And the thing about Russia in that time is it didn't matter what race you were. You could work your way up to become a general in the Russian army, a Russian military, or a navy at that point. And it didn't matter if you were native or not. You could be, Alexander Putin was African. He's a poet, so he was really high up in rank. We had generals from the region, whether they were Aleut, they were called Aleut, but they became Navy officers and generals in the military. So they worked their way up. You weren't discriminated against like you were with the Spanish or the American because of your skin color. And during the Russian period, because of the Orthodox Church, they were able to stop Baranov from exterminating us. And they were able to, yes, they were also about proselytizing and bringing in the Word of God and all of that. But they also had schools that taught in the native language, whether it was Unangan, Sugpiat, Tlingit, Yupik, Athabaskan. The languages were written down. Yes, they're written into the Bible, but they were written down. And the schools taught those. So you learned how to read and write in Alutiiq and how to teach in Alutiiq, as well as Russian. Myself growing up, there was elders who spoke at least three languages. That was English, Alutiiq, and Russian. Myself growing up, we were always told, you guys are just dumb savages, you guys don't know anything. And I was always baffled by that. I'm like, well, these elders, you can take them out anywhere and they can thrive in this environment. And by the way, they speak three languages. How many languages do you speak? Everybody only spoke one. That was English. And so during the Russian period, it was harsh at the initial contact. Then during that period, up until 1867, it was a majority of the natives who were running the companies, who were managing things for the Russian-American company. There was no more than 900 Russians in Alaska at any one time during that period. So there wasn't a lot of Russians. And even of those Russians, I would assume a majority of them were native Siberians and people from Finland. The majority of the officers were Finnish. So it was not as harsh as the other colonialists in that reference, in that setting, because of the Orthodox Church. The early American colonization, not necessarily enslavement, colonization was, I would have to say, probably pretty degrading for the people, because they came in, the first, I would say from 1867 to the time that Sheldon Jackson took over, people were left alone. The churches had their schools, at least in our region. And then when Sheldon Jackson came in, everything changed. They divided up Alaska based on religion and English-only policies. And also, because of our skin color, we couldn't own land, we couldn't run any companies or anything like that. We couldn't have any property at all. If you think about just having no control of your own finances, I would say pretty scary. And that continued up, I would say, until the 60s in many ways, because just the policies, the English-only policies. Can you imagine? I mean, my grandmother had to deal with this. My mother had to deal with this. Having teachers come into your house and say you can't speak that effing language to them, it's making them stupid. Things like that, where the teachers would go in and tell the parents who only spoke Alutiiq that they couldn't speak it. When you have 90% of your population, when 90% of your people are nearly exterminated, the resistance would be very minimal. I think what happened is the people who survived just put their heads down and did everything they could to survive. People can... it's not an easy issue to talk about, of what happened. Because the people who became more Russian or Creole were seen as sellouts, and the natives who kept things alive were systematically suppressed because of them being seen as country bumpkins, as idiots. And you had the American system coming in and playing on that. So you play people against each other, and you create animosity in the community to the haves and have-nots. And that has been played out and plays out in Kodiak and plays out, and I think all across Alaska in some ways. And it's used as a way to conquer and divide. Whether people see that or not, it has divided the communities. And we got to see that when we had another Christian religion come into Kodiak and Old Harbor during the 50s, 60s, 40s, all that time period. And what they would do is try to bribe the kids to come over to the religion with candy and food and all this stuff. And once they got them in to be baptized into theirs, then they would use it to pit them against the other community members. And so you get this division within the community. And so that conquering and dividing worked. You had entire families who chose one religion over another, even though they're both Christian. One's just 2,000 years old and one's a couple hundred. And you have them fighting on that level, at that belief level. It created a lot of animosity within the community. And nobody talks about that because it's still something that is, I want to say raw, but something that we all have living knowledge of and living experience of. And it's something that it's really ironic because of the way religion is used about, open and loving. And yet, in this instance, it's about conquering and dividing, not bringing people together. So there's a lot of animosity, a lot of hate, a lot of anger, a lot of pain, and raw pain that's still living today. And I think that having these conversations is something to have us start, but understand that there's no right or wrong answers, but we have to have the conversation. And if we don't, we're going to continue that same path and pattern. Well, the Sugpiat people of the Kodiak, Alaska Peninsula, and Prince William Sound, to me, they're people of resilience. We have been nearly decimated. We took the second brunt of the Russian contact and then took the first brunt of the American contact in terms of subjugation and humiliation and all these other things. Yet we're still here. We have been able to, even under these extreme things, keep our culture alive in many ways through not necessarily our language. Our language we're struggling with, but our traditional ways of living. You go to the village, you go to the rural communities. Every kid that lives there, that's grown up there.